This is the lecture for Module 8. I'm going to offer some reflections on Part 1 and Part 2 of Arturo Escobar's book, Designs for the Pluriverse, subtitled Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds. This was published in 2018. He does have a more recent book that came out in 2020 called Pluriversal Politics. And prior to that, Escobar had published an important book in 1995 that was titled Encountering Development, subtitled The Making and Unmaking of the Third World. Escobar is a Colombian-American anthropologist. He's at the University of North Carolina in their anthropology department. In this 1995 book, as the title suggests, he was offering an attempt at intellectual resistance to the UN and American inspired development plan in the post-World War II era, after the US and the Allies had defeated the Nazis. There was this attempt to rebuild not only Europe, but to develop what Truman, U.S. President Harry Truman, considered to be the underdeveloped third world, right, the global south. And so Arturo Escobar has been a critic for decades of this approach to modernization and globalization and the standard neoliberal capitalist approach to progress, let's call it. And in this book that we are reading, Designs for the Pluriverse, he's turning his attention as an anthropologist to design, and not just to the study of design, but to ways in which design is being taken up by anthropologists and sociologists to think about how we do society, how we make society, and how we make worlds together. There are movements like critical design theory already underway, and design turn in anthropology, and an ontological turn in design, as well as in anthropology and in political theory. And so Escobar is really examining this nexus of trends in and around anthropology, politics, and increasingly the design world. Design here should be taken in its broadest sense, right? We're talking about everything from stone tools, used to for various reasons and involved in hunting, to microchips and microprocessors and nuclear reactors and all of the earth-shaking inventions of the 20th century. And, smartphones also. Design is, in some sense, a world-making endeavor. And design is not just something that humans do to their tools, because when humans design tools, again, whether we're talking about Stone Age hand axes or information age smartphones, the tools then feed back onto their designers to redesign us, right? And so we design our world, and our world designs us back, as Anne Marie Willis puts it, quoted by Escobar. As she puts it even more simply, design designs, right? And so we're caught in a recursive feedback loop here with our tools. And Escobar is turning to design and to a kind of Heideggerian critique of technology in an effort to surface what might otherwise go, and largely does go, unnoticed, right? The way that our world is designed, but in a kind of unconscious way, at least in an ideologically mystified way. And he wants to point out the ways that so much of modern design has been shaped by a kind of neoliberal ideology driven by market forces and the profit-seeking machinations of transnational corporations in cahoots with states which have been captured, right, by lobbyists. Escobar is trying to bring activists and academics into dialogue with designers so that we can begin to resist this form of ideological capture in our design of all forms of technology. He is, resisting global capitalism and pointing our attention to alternative movements like degrowth and commoning and transition imaginations. He mentions Schumacher College, which is in Totnes, England. Several of the PCC faculty have taught there in the past. I've taught there. It's Totnes is one of the first transition towns, trying to imagine a post-fossil fuel future, to live more locally, right? So Escobar mentions this as a site of resistance in England, but most of his attention is focused on Latin America. He's Colombian, as I mentioned, and he talks a lot about the resistance movements in South America and in Central America. The Zapatistas in Chiapas, the southern part of Mexico, it's an autonomous part of what is called Mexico. And Escobar talks about, and really draws the title of his book in some sense, in part, let's say, from their statement that the Zapatistas are seeking a world where many worlds fit, right? And so Escobar is trying to amplify these resistance movements in service of a move from the monotheistic market religion of neoliberal modernity to a pluriverse of one planet, yes, but a planet that has room enough for many ways of worlding, right? And so he's engaged in a form of ontological politics, as we've talked about in prior modules. Ontology here is, it's a term that refers to the study of existence. It's a attempt to understand what types of entities there are, what types of agencies there are, but in a pluralistic context, and to engage in a kind of ontological politics, we need to keep in mind that different societies, different collectives have different ways of worlding, right? Different ways of assigning agency to different kinds of entities, right? So each society populates its world in a unique way. Now, of course, all these worlds more or less overlap with one another, and while we would want to challenge this universal abstract category of the human because of the ways that historically it has been so Eurocentric, nonetheless, we can say that Homo sapiens, right, our species, has enough in common as a evolved and co-evolved species. We have enough in common with one another that generally our societies and cultures overlap enough that we can get along, right? We can, with effort and compassion, right, and sustained attention, we can get to understand each other. We can come to understanding. We can come in nonviolent ways to allow our worlds even to overlap. This is the hope, at least, right? And it's part of what this ontological turn in politics and anthropology is trying to explore. How do we inhabit one planet with room enough for many worlds? Now, while he wants to direct our attention to design and engineering, it's clear that so far in certainly modern history, but you could even go back to human history beginning in the Neolithic with the agricultural revolution, so-called, and this was a shift in the means of production that seems to have taken place independently on multiple continents. At, after the last ice age, and gradually human beings moved from being hunter-gatherers to becoming increasingly settled. Large cities developed and empires, and all of this involves design choices, right? In order to farm on a massive scale, you need to engineer the hydrological flows in a region, and that requires massive engineering projects, right? And at this point in history, we can look back and say that engineering has been really an agent of defuturing and deworlding, right? We've made a major design error, and there are all these instances where we've become increasingly locked into, as a result of certain design choices, to certain ways of life that are extractive and unsustainable in the extreme, right? And so there's a real urgency here in Escobar's project. I mean, there's a real urgency in all of the texts that we're reading this semester, because we're in the Anthropocene, right? And it's clear that the whole Earth has been redesigned by the human being, and these same technologies we use to redesign the Earth have again fed back upon us and redesigned us, right? So whatever the human is, it's never been something separate from the sorts of technologies and design choices and practices that we have been making, from the stone tool to the microchip, again, right? And so, like Thomas Berry and Brian Swim and their book, The Universe Story, Escobar is calling us to nothing less than a reinvention of the human being, a reinvention of many human beings' ways of being, right? And one of the ways he's trying to invite us into this reinvention, this reimagination of the human, and reimagination of the ways that we make worlds together, is through a critique of a certain kind of Cartesian rationality and the reconstruction of what he's calling a relational form of rationality, right? So Cartesian rationality would be separative, dualistic, patriarchal, and hierarchical, elevating, mind and spirit over matter, the body, elevating the male over the female. Cartesian rationality is patriarchal, whereas relational rationality would be matriarchal. And here, when we talk about matriarchy and patriarchy, it's important to reference, as Escobar does, the work of Claudia von Verlhoff. I've linked you in the course resources page for modules 8 and 9 to an essay of von Verlhoff's on patriarchal alchemy. Escobar draws on her work a few times in these first two parts of his book, Designs for the Pluriverse. He mentions her the first time on page 10. And I wanted to share with you, just as, supplemental reading, if you are interested and can get to it, or maybe for your final paper, you want to draw this in, where she's comparing matriarchal alchemy, the original alchemy, if you will, to and using it to challenge patriarchal alchemy. And she points out that these terms, patriarchy and matriarchy, usually patriarchy is translated as rule by men, which would then lead to matriarchy being translated as rule by women. And she points out, there never was, historically speaking, a society ruled by women in the sense that men would rule in a patriarchal society. And she does some etymological work to retranslate arche, not as simply, not as implying some kind of a a hierarchy, right, or a dominator relationship, form of rule over others. But arche means origin, and she even relates it to this quite archaic meaning that it refers to uterus, right, the origin of new people, right? And so matriarchy, with this etymological insight from Verlhoff, becomes a form of society where women are understood to be the origin of life, right? And she points out the ways that monotheistic patriarchal religions have tended to imagine that God would be a man capable of giving birth autonomously, and kind of pokes fun at this. So if you're interested, check out her essay that's titled, it's actually a chapter titled "Losing Faith in Progress, Capitalist Patriarchy as an Alchemical System." And it's in a book that she's co-edited with a few co-authors that's titled "There is an Alternative, Subsistence and Worldwide Resistance to Corporate Globalization." So check that out. There's a sustained critique of liberalism, neoliberalism, certainly, but also liberalism by Escobar in this text. And I think for good reason, right? There's a certain kind of disembedded abstract individualism and a kind of consumerism that is encouraged in liberal societies typically. And I think when we read in Module 10, Dan Dombrowski's book, we'll see, in drawing on the most famous liberal philosopher of the 20th century, John Rawls, that there might be some redeeming features of liberalism, and that the idea of individual rights rooted in, the dignity of personhood, that this might be a view we don't want to let go of too quickly. I mean, certainly there are ways in which it can become pathological. If there's an overemphasis on individual freedom, it can lead to an underappreciation for our social responsibilities and for social justice. And certainly, to the extent that liberalism has been wed to capitalism, that liberal democracy, quote unquote, has been wed to capitalism, it's obvious that it needs to be reimagined in some ways. The critique of the self, the idea of a substantial self that Escobar engages in, drawing on the work of Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche in a book called The Embodied Mind, a very important book for me as a cognitive science major, as an undergrad. And Escobar talks about their use of Buddhism and a particular school of Buddhism, Madhyamaka Buddhism, which really emphasizes this doctrine of dependent co-origination. And, Varela emphasizes the sense in which the self is not a substance, the mind is not a thing. He talks about a virtual self that is always sort of in process and in the making. And he describes the self as a kind of nexus of relations, right? Relations, social relations. And, here I thought I could connect this for you to Whitehead's metaphysics, where similarly, what we think of as, the human person is really what he calls a society, or indeed a nexus. And Varela was a reader of Whitehead. The self is a kind of nexus of relationships. And it's true, though, we inherit our own past memories with a higher degree of importance and emphasis and intensity than we inherit, our memories of other people. And so, our sense of personal identity is explainable by Whitehead because of the way that our nervous system really shelters this intense experience of inwardness. And we'll see also in Module 10 when Dombrowski talks about Whitehead's understanding of religion as what a individual does with his or her solitude, that when Whitehead refers to solitude, he always presupposes a solidarity with the world community, right? And so there's a way in which I would want us to, and we will in chapter 10, in module 10, have an opportunity to lean into an understanding of personhood that doesn't totally erase the idea of individuality, I would say, but that just redefines it as always individuality in community, always self in relation, self in society, self as a nexus of relations, but still with a capacity for creative self-expression, right? So I think with Whitehead's help, and not that Varela wasn't already hip to this, but with Whitehead's help, we might be able to strike a bit of somewhat better balance in our handling of individual, the idea of the individual self. Certainly we want to avoid individualism, but I also think there's something worth defending in the idea of individual rights, right? Which many liberals would put at the center of their political philosophy, even if liberalism, particularly neoliberalism, doesn't live up to the idea of protecting the rights of individual persons, at least human beings. One of the problems is that the Western modernity gave personhood to corporations, right? And that led to less attention being paid to concrete, actual, flesh and blood human persons. I also want to say a bit about Heidegger. Heidegger has a very influential critique of technology, modern technology, though, as we'll see in Module 10, Dombrowski has a whole section on Heidegger. He's quite critical of Heidegger because, he was an unrepentant Nazi. And he, in critiquing technology, made this infamous comparison late in his life. So, after the Holocaust, after World War II, in an interview, I believe, he compared the gas chambers in Nazi Germany to the factory farming industry in America, right? And said that these are, the mechanized slaughter of cows and pigs is morally equivalent, is what he's implying, to the mechanized slaughter of Jews and other undesirables in Nazi Germany. And so, infamous comment. And, so I think I share it to put his critique of technology in context. It's not that it isn't powerful and urgent, but also clearly in Heidegger's hands was, I would say, ethically abused. Heidegger does, though, ironically, try to call our attention to the way that being itself calls forth this emotion of care. Sorge in German, care, is rooted ontologically, and Heidegger wants to draw our attention to emotion and its importance in how the world is able to show itself to us. How we experience the world, and the process of worlding very much depends on our moods, our emotions, and isn't solely something that the rational mind is analyzing and constructing from a disembodied objective point of view. Rather, the world appears to us in response, in some sense, in a participatory way to how we are attending to it. And I wanted to connect this Heideggerian insight to Whitehead and his discussion of this Quaker notion of concern. He thinks that all creatures, all beings, all actual occasions of experience in his terms, right? So every actual entity from an electron to an elephant to a human being has this concern, this subjective response and emotional tonality to their experience that that makes them feel in some sense, responsible for others. And why? Well, because we're literally made of each other in Whitehead's cosmology and in his ontology, his understanding of what kind of beings there are. The kind of beings that there are in Whitehead's cosmos are the kind of beings that dwell within one another and, dependently co-arise and are mutually immanent, right? And so concern arises out of this. And I think Whitehead's understanding of concern is very much resonant with Heidegger's understanding of care. There's an important critique of the whole artificial intelligence movement in computer design, you could say, and programming, from Hubert Dreyfus, who's, again, inheriting the existential phenomenology of Heidegger, to point out the ways that the human mind and human intelligence is so contextual and embodied and situated that no account of mind in terms of abstract symbolic information processing is ever going to achieve anything like what we call intelligence, in a computer terminal or in a robot of some kind. And so Hubert Dreyfus, wrote some books with titles like What Computers Can't Do, and a few years later, What Computers Still Can't Do. And this tradition of Heideggerian critique of computational ways of thinking about mind and how we might build an artificial mind or artificial intelligence is continued in the work of Winograd and Flores, which you'll see that Escobar draws on creatively. In connection with Heidegger and on care and Whitehead on concern, Humberto Maturana, who is a Chilean cognitive scientist and philosopher, like Francisco Varela. Varela was Maturana's student and then co-author and collaborator. And Maturana had a way of talking about language, and he would refer to it as languaging, and the way that it's so important for the social life of human beings. And Maturana would remind us that while rationality is important and our ability to engage in dialogue with one another in a reasonable way is so important, but he reminds us that we have to decide to be rational by cultivating a certain kind of emotion, right? There's a certain emotional prerequisite for this form of reasonable dialogue, right? And so rather than think of rationality and emotionality as somehow diametrically opposed, Maturana is pointing out that there's a certain emotion, and he just refers to it as love. That's a kind of prerequisite for being reasonable. And this connects to what I and some of my writing have tried to argue, that the kind of rationality we want would be a relational form of rationality where knowledge is always understood to be built out of alliances, and that it's knowing something is always a diplomatic activity because you're consulting with, negotiating with other beings. And for you to claim that how other beings are going to behave in a certain situation, well, you're going to need to have gotten to know those beings, right? So the idea would be not that we want to get rid of rationality, Cartesian rationality, yes, right? Because that would be a non-relational dualistic form of rationality. But there are alternative rationalities wherein emotion is not excised and put to the side, amputated, as it were, but is just a presupposition of a condition that makes possible our ability to meet with and engage with and participate with one another in world making. Escobar refers to the importance of searching within the West for alternative Wests. And we started this semester, modules 2 and 3, reading Catherine Keller, and she was indeed trying to resuscitate an alternative West, right? Pointing out the ways that Christianity, though of course it has, so often in history participated in empowering patriarchy, empowering militarism, empowering colonization. There's an auto deconstruction of Christianity, like within the own tradition, within the tradition itself. There are resources from which to, criticize the militarism and the patriarchy and the colonialism and the white supremacy, certainly. And it's important that I think Escobar acknowledges this, and that we who are Westerners or inheritors of this tradition, this lineage, which is it's always already hybrid. I wouldn't want to say that there's some sort of essence that is the West. Key figures in the so-called Western tradition were born in Africa, and there's a huge, Islamic influence on Western theology and philosophy and so on. And so, we have to keep this in mind, that the West is not a pure essence; it's a hybrid, and ultimately, every cultural nexus is a hybrid, right? It's just that it's a nexus of relations. But there is something characteristic about Western history and society, right? And those of us who can't help but inherit some of that can find these alternative sources of resistance to the dominant narrative in the West. And Escobar is allowing us to do that. Other figures like, Thomas Berry, of course, in addition to Keller, who we read, Thomas Berry, and Escobar mentions Goethe and Goethean science as a different, more relational way of engaging with the natural world in our attempt to know it.